Main idea: the tensions between Britain and the colonies led to armed conflict in Massachusetts. One American story. On April 19, 1775, some 70 militiamen, led by Captain John Parker, gathered in Lexington, Massachusetts, a town near Boston. A militia is a force of armed civilians pledged to defend their community. About one-third of Lexington's militia were Minutemen, trained to act on a minute's warning. They had heard that the British were coming. Parker's troops had never faced soldiers. Soon they would meet the British on Lexington Green in the first battle of the Revolutionary War. According to tradition, Parker told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here." In this section, you'll read how colonial protests led to a revolution. The Intolerable Acts. The Boston Tea Party had aroused fury in Britain. One British official said that the people of Boston ought to be knocked about their ears. King George III declared, "We must master them or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." Britain chose to master the colonies. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws to punish the Massachusetts colony and to serve as a warning to other colonies. The British called these laws the Coercive Acts, but they were so harsh that the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. One of the acts would close the port of Boston until colonists paid for the destroyed tea. Others banned committees of correspondence, allowed Britain to house troops wherever necessary, and let British officials accused of crimes in the colonies stand trial in Britain. To enforce the acts, Parliament appointed General Thomas Gage governor of Massachusetts. In 1773, Sam Adams had written, "I wish we could arouse the continent." The Intolerable Acts answered his wish. Other colonies immediately offered Massachusetts their support. They sent food and money to Boston. The committees of correspondence also called for a meeting of colonial delegates to discuss what to do next. The First Continental Congress meets. In September 1774, delegates from all of the colonies except Georgia met in Philadelphia. At this meeting, called the First Continental Congress, delegates voted to ban all trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. They also called on each colony to begin training troops. Georgia agreed to be part of the actions of the Congress, even though it had voted not to send delegates. The First Continental Congress marked a key step in American history. Although most delegates were not ready to call for independence, they were determined to uphold colonial rights. This meeting planted the seeds of a future independent government. John Adams called it a nursery of American statesmen. The delegates agreed to meet in 7 months if necessary. By that time, however, fighting with Britain had begun. Between war and peace. The colonists hoped that the trade boycott would force a repeal of the Intolerable Acts. After all, past boycotts had led to the repeal of the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. This time, however, Parliament stood firm. It even increased restrictions on colonial trade and sent more troops. By the end of 1774, some colonists were preparing to fight. In Massachusetts, John Hancock headed the Committee of Safety, which had the power to call out the militia. The colonial troops continued to train. Cause and effect: growing conflict between Britain and America. 1763. Proclamation of 1763 issued. The effect: proclamation leads to anger. 1765. Stamp Act passed. The effect: boycott of British goods. Stamp Act resolves passed. 1766. Stamp Act repealed. Declaration Act passed. The effect: boycott ended. 1767. Townshend Acts passed. The effect: new boycotts. Boston Massacre. 1770. Townshend Acts repealed. The effect? Tension between colonies and Britain reduced. 1773. Tea Act passed. The effect? Boston Tea Party. 1774. Intolerable Acts passed. The effect? First Continental Congress bans trade. Militias organized. 1775. Troops ordered to Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. The effect? Militia fights British troops. Second Continental Congress. Continental Army established. Most colonial leaders believed that any fight with Britain would be short. They thought that a show of force would make Britain change its policies. Few expected a war. One who did was Patrick Henry. A voice from the past. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why should we idle here? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. From Patrick Henry, quoted in Patriots. Henry delivered what became his most famous speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses in March 1775. The Midnight Ride. Meanwhile, spies were busy on both sides. Sam Adams had built a spy network to keep watch over British activities. The British had their spies too. They were Americans who were loyal to Britain. From them, General Gage learned that the Massachusetts militia was storing arms and ammunition in Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. He also heard that Sam Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage ordered his troops to arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington and to destroy the supplies in Concord. The Sons of Liberty had prepared for this moment. Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith, and a second messenger, William Dawes, were charged with spreading the news about British troop movements. Revere had arranged a system of signals to alert colonists in Charlestown, on the shore opposite Boston. If one lantern burned in the Old North Church steeple, the British troops were coming by land. If two, they were coming by water. Revere would go across the water from Boston to Charlestown and ride to Lexington and Concord from there. Dawes would take the land route. When the British moved, so did Revere and Dawes. They galloped over the countryside on their midnight ride, spreading the news. In Lexington, they were joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott. When Revere and Dawes were stopped by a British patrol, Prescott broke away and carried the message to Concord. Lexington and Concord. At the dawn of April 19, some 700 British troops reached Lexington. They found Captain John Parker and about 70 militiamen waiting. The British commander ordered the Americans to drop their muskets. They refused. No one knows who fired first, but within a few minutes 8 militiamen lay dead. The British then marched to Concord, where they destroyed military supplies. A battle broke out at a bridge north of town, forcing the British to retreat. Nearly 4,000 Minutemen and militiamen arrived in the area. They lined the road from Concord to Lexington and peppered the retreating redcoats with musket fire. It seemed as if men came down from the clouds, one soldier said. Only the arrival of 1,000 more troops saved the British from destruction as they scrambled back to Boston. Lexington and Concord were the first battles of the Revolutionary War. As Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote, colonial troops had fired the shot heard round the world. Americans would now have to choose sides and back up their political opinions by force of arms. Those who supported the British were called loyalists. Those who sided with the rebels were patriots. The conflict between two sides divided communities, families, and friends. The war was on.